All right, causes of the revolution, American Revolution, that is, part two. Of course, as we saw the previous day, the British government had tried to impose a series of tax measures to pay off the French and Indian War, which the colonists really did not appreciate, claiming they'd already paid off the war by helping fight it, and claiming that they had no representation in Parliament, so therefore they wouldn't be paying any taxes, called no taxation without representation. The British government arguing that they had the right to tax Texans, had the right to tax British citizens and what we know as Americans in the British colonies in America, because the British Parliament had the right to tax all British possessions everywhere. And the fact that the colonists started the 7 Years' War, the World War, the French and Indian War, and so they should help pay for it, and because colonists were undertaxed as it was. So we had seen how some of those measures, not only the tax measures, but also like the Townshend Acts, but also, for example, the Quartering Act had led to some violence like the Boston Massacre. But after the Boston Massacres, both sides sort of pulled back and said, wait, we didn't really mean for this to happen. The British government certainly, never meant for their own citizens to be shot down in the streets, and the Sons of Liberty and others never meant for their anger to spill over and get innocent civilians shot either. So for a time, it looked like, well, everything might go back the way it was, with good, loyal British colonists. But then came the Tea Act of 1773. The purpose of the Tea Act is not like any other purpose that we've seen yet. It wasn't to pay off the French and Indian War debt. It didn't have anything to do with raising taxes. The whole purpose was to save a company from going bankrupt. So I'm sure you're writing this down on your chart. But to save the British East India Tea Company from going broke. So the whole purpose of this law was to save a British company from going bankrupt. And that company was the British East India Tea Company. The British East India Tea Company, as its name implies, was a British company in East India that grew and sold tea. Clever naming, isn't it? So India was a long way away from Britain, but by this time Britain had many colonies, not just the Americas, around the world. And in this case, some of the colonies in India, the British colonies in India, grew and transported tea to Britain. The British became great tea drinkers, and the British Americans, were also great tea drinkers as well. Unfortunately, first of all, Americans weren't drinking a lot of tea. Well, not British East India tea. They were still drinking a lot of tea, but it actually was smuggled in from the Dutch, from the people of the Netherlands, which is a country in Northern Europe, who basically sent it directly over to the Americas. And without any taxes, it was basically over half as cheap as the British tea. The British tea, as it came from India, was taxed as it entered into the country. Then the tea was taken off, probably the British ships had to come from India, and they were put on British ships going to America, and then the British ships had to reach America. All that added to transportation cost. So with transportation cost and taxes, the British tea was extremely expensive, and probably about 90% of Americans drank smuggled Dutch tea instead. So the tea was actually sort of piling up in British warehouses, tons and tons and tons of it, and was not being sold. And all this was bad for the British government because the British East India Tea Company was one of the biggest taxpayers the government had. Basically, every year, the British East India Tea Company paid about 400,000 pounds, £500,000, a British unit of currency, to the British government. And remembering the British government was heavily in debt. Again, the French and Indian War cost about 70 million pounds. But at least, with big companies like this, the British government could, at least run the country, even though being heavily in debt. Unfortunately, since the tea was not being sold, the company was on the verge of going bankrupt, which first of all meant that all the employees in India would go off the payroll. Then it basically meant that a lot of sailors would not be transporting tea from India and England back and forth, and therefore they would be out of a job. The shipping companies would lose money. The British government would lose a lot of tax money, and a lot of dock workers in England would be out of jobs. So it was pretty important to keep this company operational. So eventually, the British came up with the Tea Act of 1773. And the Tea Act of 1773 basically removed almost all the taxes from the tea. And it allowed the tea to be sent directly to America. So it didn't have to come to England anymore. So you could skip the middleman. You could basically make the transportation cost cheaper, and you could also make the tea cheaper in America because you're taking off basically all the taxes. Well, there was one tax that was left over. It was a penny tax, but it was basically called the King's tax, and it sort of went to support the king on many items of the day. But again, one penny per pound of tea is not going to break you if you're buying the tea. And in fact, with all the British had done, now the British tea was cheaper than the Dutch tea, which now meant that, of course, Americans would buy that good old British tea and keep the company in business. All was good. So now the British government says, hey, look, we figured out a plan to help everybody. Everybody's going to be happy with this. We, the British government, are going to be happy because the company will still be in business and they'll still be giving us their tax revenue. Yes. The British East India Tea Company will be happy because they're going to stay in business and all their employees are going to be happy. All those sailors that transport the tea back and forth, they're going to still have their jobs. Everybody's going to be happy. And finally, the British government says, finally, we're going to make those Americans happy because we're giving them cheap tea. They can't even smuggle it as cheap as us. Finally, we're going to make everyone happy. Finally. So let's see what the effects of the Tea Act of 1773 are. Angered colonists. I know. They're an angry bunch, aren't they? And you're probably going, how can they be angry? Well, conspiracy theories. Americans have always loved conspiracy theories. And this conspiracy theory was that, yes, the tea was cheap. And the reason tea was cheap and the taxes were taken off and all that good stuff was because once Americans started drinking this British East India tea, then they were going to raise the tea prices really, really high. And by that time, all the other tea companies, all the other people that used smuggled tea, all the other merchants that smuggled in Dutch tea, by that time, they'd all be bankrupt. Because with everyone buying British East India tea for a year or two, that means the smuggled tea, no one was going to buy it, so the merchants that were selling it were going to go bankrupt, and soon there'd be only the British East India tea, at which point the British government would raise their price and add taxes. And besides, there was that penny tax anyway. No taxation without representation. Boycott. We're going to boycott that tea. Not going to drink tea. And of course, the problem was, you really can't tell. Maybe the British are smart enough, the British government's smart enough to basically label it as Dutch tea and smuggle it in the country. And you'll be drinking the Dutch tea. So Americans say, we'll just stop drinking all tea. Pretty clever, except for the fact that there weren't many other beverages to drink. Well, if you wanted to stay healthy. Of course, you could drink alcohol, a lot of that, but that didn't make you healthy. It basically made you drunk and eventually rotted out your body and eventually you died. And of course, it certainly wasn't good for kids. Now, there was milk, but oftentimes, in some places, it was really hard to get. And in some places, there's something called milk disease, in which you drank the milk and it would kill you within a couple of days. Because of some type of bacteria in the milk. Of course, we don't have to worry about that today because we heat up the milk. We what they call pasteurize the milk, and we homogenize the milk. So basically, our milk doesn't come from one cow. It comes from thousands and thousands of cows. They mix it all up and heat it all up to kill the bacteria. So our milk is really safe today. Back then it wasn't. So your other beverages would be water and tea. Now, unfortunately, in many places, water would actually kill you. Water would make you sick. And they didn't know why it made you sick. All they knew, if they drank the tea, that was healthy and the water was not. Of course, we know what happens is when you're boiling the water for tea, you're killing the impurities in the water. If any harmful bacteria are in the water, when you're boiling the water for tea, it kills that bacteria. And therefore, whatever bacteria was there is dead, and now your tea is just really healthy for you, as well as tasting good. So by giving up the tea, the colonists really were willing actually to sacrifice their health. They were sacrificing their health for this boycott. So boycott tea. And can't let that tea come ashore. Nope. So when the British cargo ships, now in some cases when the British cargo ships arrive, there's someone at the dock saying, hey, if you try to unload this tea, there's going to be problems. There's going to be riots. There's going to be bad stuff. So in several colonies, the British tea shipments actually arrived, but the British ships turned around and went back to England when they realized there was going to be some problems. But in Boston, the governor of Boston and his sons were going to be the merchants that sold the tea. So the governor and his sons were going to be the guys that got rich off selling this tea. So when the tea arrives, the governor wants the tea to arrive. The governor wants this tea when it arrives on the 3 ships. But the dock workers refuse to unload the tea. So that's where it sits for 30 months. After the tea arrives in Boston, it's sitting on these 3 ships at port. The governor orders the tea unloaded, but the dock worker said, we're not unloading that ship. What the governor was waiting for was the 30 days to end. There was a law in Massachusetts which basically said after 30 days, if a ship was not unloaded, the governor could use military force to unload the ship. That is, the governor could use military troops to unload the ships and get the tea anyway. Now, on the night just before the governor was going to use his emergency powers, there's a big meeting at Old South, the meeting house, the church. And there the Sam Adams, the Sons of Liberty member, was speaking. There were other Sons of Liberty members speaking about how terrible this tea situation was, and how the tea should just be sent back to England, and how it was all a plot against the colonists, and how there's that 1-cent tax on the tea. And at one point, Sam Adams simply said, you know, there's nothing more we can do here. There's nothing that can save us. And all of a sudden, from outside or inside, the colonists started hearing, whoa, 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 Indians, Indians. But it wasn't an Indian attack, and there weren't even Indians. They were colonists dressed as Indians. They were colonists that had their face painted, and perhaps were wearing some clothing that resembled Indian clothing, and perhaps had some headdresses that resembled Indian headdresses. And as the crowd came out of the church, and there were several thousand of them, plus the crowd, several thousand outside because the church couldn't hold them on, they saw about 150 men marching down to the docks. And the crowd followed them. And when the men got down to the docks, they were very nice. They went on the ship and asked the captains for their keys. Of course, the captains didn't have much choice. The men boarded all 3 ships. The Sons of Liberty members boarded all 3 ships. They basically took the cargo out from the cargo hold. They opened up the box. They took the tea shipments out. And then they basically started throwing the tea overboard. Now, it actually took several hours because there was so much tea, tons and tons of tea on board these 3 ships, that it took several hours to basically dump all the tea overboard. At the end of this exercise, the Sons of Liberty on all 3 ships cleaned up the ships. They swept the ships, they mopped the ships. They basically left the ships exactly as they had been, except no tea on board. And they handed the keys back to the captain, and the Sons of Liberty marched off with the crowd cheering them on and yelling, "Yay, yay!" You know, we've won. Of course, basically the message is to the British government, we don't want your tea. But the British government saw it quite differently. They saw this as something that was intolerable. They saw this as destruction of private property. It was one thing if you're protesting against the government and maybe destroying a government office building, like a government tax office, or if you're, maybe beating up a tax collector, something like that. But the British East India Tea Company was not the British government. It was a private company, and the tea was private property, and it had been destroyed. And for the British government, this was simply intolerable. It was bad enough that these colonists were, angry at the British government, had been doing all these things to disrupt what the British government was trying to do in America, and actually attack British government officials and actually attack British government officers. But this was a private company. This was too much. And as soon as news reached England, the British Parliament passed something called the Intolerable Acts, which is effect number 4, but it's also going to be the next law, the Intolerable Acts, or as the British government called them, the Coercive Acts, because they wanted to coerce the Americans. They wanted to make these American colonists behave and do what the British government wanted them to do. Now, the Intolerable Acts of 1774 had four purposes. One, the port of Boston was closed down until the tea was paid for. No ships coming in, no ships going out. And to enforce the boycott, the Royal Navy would station its warships at Boston, so no private ships could come in or no private ships could leave without the government's permission. So until that tea's paid for, your port's closed. And of course, it's a port city. So a large portion of the 16,000 people in Boston depended upon the port. They depended upon their jobs as something they might have been rope makers, they might have been sail makers, they might have repaired stuff on the ships, they might have been dock workers, they might have been warehouse workers, where you unload your stuff from the ships. So a lot of jobs in Boston depended upon the port being open, but now it was closed until the tea was paid for. Second, the Massachusetts Charter was canceled. The charter, which the king had given back in 1630 when the Puritans had first come over, was canceled. Of course, that charter had basically said that the people, the males at least, could elect leaders and run their own local affairs. But no more of that, the British government said. No, we have a royal governor. We're going to appoint a new royal governor, and the royal governor will tell you what to do. Your only job is to do what the royal governor tells you to do. No more of this voting stuff. No more of these locally elected assemblies. No more democracy as we would have it. No. We, the British government, will tell you what to do through our governor, and then you guys will do it. Some trials, number 3, some trials will be held in Britain. So what had been happening was that sometimes the British government had actually arrested some of these Sons of Liberty members who had been causing troubles, but then when they tried them in the local courts, the juries would always find these Sons of Liberty members innocent, even though they were guilty. So you might have a Son of Liberty member beating up a tax collector. They were arrested. The sheriff brought them into court. You might have 20 witnesses saying, yes, that's the man who attacked the tax collector. And then the jury would go out and come back in like 5 minutes and say, innocent, not guilty, and the guy would be set free. But now some of these trials are going to be coming to England. They're going to take these people that are charged with crimes and send them to England. And of course, you can already guess what the verdict's going to be in England. Also, a new quartering act is going to be passed, or is passed, under the Coercive Acts. And the new quartering act says, we're not asking you for places for our soldiers to stay, we're taking it now. So under this act, if there was an abandoned public building, no problem, we're taking over. Hey, your house looks nice. Some of our soldiers can stay in one of your bedrooms. Oh, what? You don't like that? No problem. We'll take over the whole house from you. Thanks anyway. So you people in Massachusetts who are causing all this trouble, you're not going to have any jobs basically until this is over. You're not going to be voting. You people that are doing the bad stuff, you're going to be sent for England for a trial. And basically, we're going to station soldiers in your house. Don't like it? Tough luck. Now, at the very same time the British Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, Control Acts, they also passed another set of laws called the Quebec Act. Now, technically, the Quebec Acts are not part of the Intolerable Acts. Technically, they're aimed at Canada, but in some ways, they are part of punishing the American colonists. So the Quebec Act actually has two purposes. One, set up a government for Canada. So you remember that just a few years earlier, that Canada had been French. It had been New France. And so in New France, there had been Frenchmen speaking French, going to Roman Catholic churches, and doing things the French way. But now that the English had taken over Canada, now there were some English people there speaking English, being Protestants, not Catholics, and doing things the English way. How are you going to run this place? And so that's basically what the Quebec Act did. And basically the Quebec Act was somewhat generous. It basically says that you two groups stay doing what you're doing as long as you're loyal to the British government. That is, you French people keep on speaking French, keep on doing things the French way, keep on going to your Roman Catholic churches. That's fine, as long as you're loyal to England. And you English people, you know, obviously you're speaking English and you're going to Protestant churches and do things the English way, and that's fine as long as you're loyal to England. So basically it allowed the French to continue their way of life in what has now become an English area, and that worked pretty well at first, but over time that presented problems, and for a number of years the French in Quebec would actually vote on whether to leave Canada and start their own little country, and the vote was always very close. So right now, of course, Canada is still united. There's still basically Quebec, which is basically still a French-speaking territory, and basically does things the French way, and basically is Roman Catholic. And then there's the rest of Canada, which is basically English, basically speaks English, and basically does things the English way, and basically Protestants. Basically Quebec is sort of kept in Canada because the rest of Canada spends a lot of tax money. That is, basically the English speakers basically spend a whole lot of money sending it to Quebec to make those people happy so they won't leave Canada. So the Quebec Act worked for the time in the 1770s, but it wasn't not really a long-term solution. I mean, it's held together, but just barely. Now, the second thing of importance for us is that the purpose of the Quebec Act was to prevent colonial westward expansion. They didn't want American colonials moving west. They wanted American colonials along the seacoast so the British government could watch them, so the British government could impose its laws upon them, so the Americans simply couldn't move away. So what had been happening over time, ever since Jamestown, Virginia, 1607, every time the British government had sent over a law and people didn't like that law in the town you lived in, you simply moved away from that town and started another town. And so the British Americans had moving further and further west, and of course had now moved over the Appalachian Mountains, and some of them had wanted that new land. But the British government says, no, that proclamation line of 1763 is still going to be there, and you American colonists, you're going to stay on the coast. You're going to stay in that area from the Atlantic Ocean to the mountains, and we're going to be able to watch you now, and we're going to be able to enforce our law now, because now you won't be able to move west. So as you can see here, under the Quebec Act, basically the Quebec area, Canada, gets the Ohio River Valley area, the area that many Americans had just fought for and some had died for in the French and Indian War. And then notice that sort of reddish-orange area, which is going to be an Indian reserve. It's going to be reserved for Indians. So again, all those other non-Indian Americans can basically keep to the coast, where the British will watch them closely and make sure they're enforcing the law. So, I don't think I obviously did not need to tell you the first effect at all. Obviously, if a 1 penny tax on tea angered the colonists, how about getting them fired from their jobs? How about sending them to England for a trial? How about taking away their right to vote? How about making sure they never had advanced economic opportunities anymore because you can go west to get any more land? angered colonists is probably the understatement of the 1700s. They were furious. And soon, 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia. 12 of the 13 colonies sent delegates, members, to meet in Philadelphia to discuss what they could do about these terrible, awful laws. The only colony that didn't send a member was Georgia. One, because Georgia was so far south that by the time the member actually reached Philadelphia, the meeting would have been over anyway. And second of all, the governor of Georgia, the royal governor, was a very strong advocate of the British government and refused to allow anybody to be sent from Georgia. Plus, of course, Georgia had a very small population to begin with anyway. So 12 of the 13 colonies met in what's called the Continental Congress, representing the continent of America, which is actually just the eastern seaboard of America at the time, to discuss what they can do about these terrible, awful, intolerable acts. We just can't stand them. And of course, the first thing the Continental Congress did was boycott. We're going to stop buying everything. We're not just boycotting tea again. We're boycotting everything the British send over. Not going to spend a cent on these British-made products. We'll make our own. Even though they might be inferior, we'll make our own. If we can't get them, that's all right. We still won't buy from the British. Let's see how they like being poor for a change. That'll change their mind. Also, get your militias ready, the First Continental Congress said to all 13 colonies. We hope that this ends peacefully. We hope the boycott works like it has before. We hope the British government will come to its senses. But if they don't, we might have to fight for our rights as Englishmen. So get your militias ready. Make sure, for example, now at the time, every colony had militias. Basically, every major town had militias. But generally, these militias may be practiced once a month, and they practiced after church, and then basically went out to drink. But now, the Continental Congress is saying, no, make sure that militias are well practiced. Make sure that, for example, every Sunday after church, these militiamen are practicing, and they're practicing for a longer period of time. Make sure every militiaman has a weapon. And in this case, there were many instances, especially in New England, of poor people who didn't have a gun. Rich people bought guns for them. The government bought guns for them and gave them a gun. Sometimes you talk about gun control today and the government controlling guns. Back then, the colonial governments were actually giving out guns to its citizens, especially the male citizens that might have to protect the colony. And another way of getting these militias ready was to create a rapid reaction force. So out of your entire militia, the Continental Congress said, you might have a small section, maybe 10%, maybe 20%, maybe up to 25% of these militia units who are ready to march at a moment's notice. So these 10 or 20% of the men or whatever should always have their weapons with them, no matter where they go. If they're out in the field farming, they should have their weapon with them. And if the alarm bells ring, those men should march immediately with their weapon to a rendezvous point, to a meeting point, and then go down to start the fight against the enemy. The rest of the militia units, when the alarm bells ring, if the alarm bells ever do ring, the rest of the militia units, if they're out plowing their fields, they have to go back and they have to put up their plows, they have to put up their horses, they have to put up their mules, they have to say goodbye to their family, they have to get their gun, and then the rest of the militia would meet, and then they would go up and support this quick reaction force. Sometimes the quick reaction force was called the Minutemen, because they were supposed to be ready at a minute's notice. But again, the Continental Congress is hopeful that the boycott will work. But if not, we may have to fight for our rights as Englishmen. So in 1774, after meeting in Philadelphia and giving the colonists this advice, the Continental Congress said, we've done everything we can in this meeting. Let's go home. We'll meet back here in a year. We'll meet back here in September 1775 and see how things are going. We hope that when we meet back here in a year in 1775, that everything's been resolved. We hope that everything's been peaceful. We hope that the British government has, come to its senses. So again, let's go back, and we will come back when hopefully things are peaceful in the next year. Sadly, very sadly, By the time the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1775, there was already shooting going on. There was already violence. There had already been military clashes between the colonial and British soldiers stationed in America. And these clashes would, of course, lead to more fighting, which would eventually lead to the creation of the United States of America. So at the end of 1763, ten years earlier, colonists had been very happy to be British. They were happy living under British rule. Just over 10 years later, in 1775, they were fighting British rule. And they were very unhappy colonists. And some of them were even getting the idea that maybe they shouldn't be colonists at all. And maybe that this fight should be about not just about righting wrongs, but about creating something new, a new country, the United States of America.